Remainders. I'm your host, Darren Burrell.
And I'm your co-host, Patrick McIntyre.
We will explore the stories from our conscious collection of music, books, and film.
The ones that have shaped our lives.
Join us as we take a closer look at what remains.
Welcome to Remainders, where we explore better living for our conscious collection of stories. My name is Patrick McIntyre.
And I'm Darren Burrell.
In this episode of Remainders, we're going to explore the book American Prison by Shane Bauer. Bauer is an investigative journalist who poses as a security guard in a privately operated prison in Louisiana, run by the Corrections Corporation of America. The purpose is to expose the inner workings of one of America's most controversial topics, prisons that work for profit, which many people consider to operate as modern-day slavery. Bauer himself suffered through imprisonment for over 2 years while reporting in Iran. But in American prison, he tries to understand what happens when there's a clear economic incentive to locking people up. Or more explicitly, who is getting rich by keeping people in prison?
This is something I need to state before we get started. I just have never explored these topics before. So thank you for bringing this book into the Remainders fold. I just really loved the book. I loved the investigative reporting aspect of it, to kind of see it from the perspective of somebody who's living in that universe. And Shane Bauer does. He becomes a CO at a prison, a private prison. And the way the book operates is it takes one chapter to tell the story of his 4 months being a CO. The next chapter after that, so it kind of trades off, we'll talk about the history of really incarceration and the way it worked as a sort of slavery in our history. And I think those are two things that I had no idea about before this, the way that private prisons work as a revenue generation system through the years, and the way that that has aligned with slavery. And, most of this I wasn't aware of. I really think reading something like this and really becoming aware of these things is so helpful, especially in times that we're living through right now, to understand what people went through, the history of our country. And a lot of the dark history is so important for us to understand so that we do not repeat what's happened to us. In the last moments of this book, there's a moment that he goes and sees some protesters outside. I don't want to give away that part because I'm sure we're going to talk about his buying one share of stock so he can attend the shareholders meeting. But Bauer witnesses somebody outside that's holding up a sign that says, "People, not profit." And to me, that's this whole book. It's about human life and human decency, not about making money. And really what this book talks about is making money on human beings, the way to turn human beings into a profit for other people's gains.
Yeah, I think that's very well put. I'm kind of there with you, obviously, as most people are, unless you're in the business of active journalism, is that it's an easy thing to not be familiar with. We live in a for-profit society where everything is supposed to be part of the marketplace, and it's easy to go without asking, should everything be for profit? Should access to healthcare be for profit? Should locking people up in prisons be for profit? I think that's one of those are some of the questions that drove Shane Bauer to do this investigation.
And let's not forget, too, that these are very hard things to think on. I don't know the answer to any of this. Even reading the book, I don't know what the answer is. How do you get through a prison system when there's people that are in there that are murderers and that are, there's obviously got to be some sort of way to rehabilitate. And obviously there's nothing right about making profit on human beings. That's not, that's an obvious answer of how to change that. Don't do it. But the whole idea of how does this all work in our society? How do prison systems work is a very difficult situation to tackle. And at one point, Pat texted me when we were talking about this, and he said, I wonder if we bit off more than we could chew with this. And I just told him before we started recording, I absolutely think we did, because there's so much to talk about here. And we're going to do the best we can to roll through the chapters and just discuss some things that we took away from it. And at the end, hopefully you'll read this book and really form some opinions of your own. And to be honest with you, Pat, I mean, I'm so much more understanding of even what just happened through our last election and why people tend to gain depending on whether a president that they want is elected. Obviously, people know that, but especially in terms of the prison system, there's a quote in there that I don't think I wrote down, so I'm just going to say it since we're talking about it now, but that when Trump won the election the first time, the shares of the correction system went up double that any other stock in the entire stock market on the day Trump won.
Yeah, and we'll get into it, but yeah, essentially Obama put a restriction on private prisons, saying the government would no longer contract with private prisons. But then when Trump was elected, the CCA, Corrections Corporation of America, that's the company that runs the prison that Shane Bauer worked in, their shares increased more than any stock on the New York Stock Exchange that day at all. So
yeah, wow.
Tells you a lot about what, one, it tells you a lot how the stock works, but then also the confidence that immigration and detention centers were going to become much more popular.
People had the foresight that, okay, now that there's this new president in here, we're going to have so much more incarcerations, which is going to generate so much more money.
Yeah. And I just want to reiterate, you made a great point that there are no easy answers. We are definitely not coming at this with the answer.
Right.
Shane Bauer wrote this entire book, and even he himself is like, well, I mean, at the end of it, there are still no clear answers on how to address this. Is reform a possibility? I really don't know.
Right. I think just the idea of thinking about it is the right move, the right place to start.
Exactly.
I did want to talk about investigative reporting in general, and I know that that's something that you said was the most important part, or what most interesting thing to you in this book. Is that right?
Yeah, that's definitely true. I mean, I've always had a long interest in that. I mean, investigative journalism and journalism in general is kind of the backbone of a functioning democratic society. We'll get into it a little bit more, but in terms of like this book, investigative journalism is an opportunity to expose injustices in a society. The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, one of my favorite books of all time. It's from the 1920s. It explored the horrible conditions of the meatpacking industry in Chicago. And that novel itself led directly to the formation of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration to protect people from overtly poisonous food. And so that's just one example. And it's kind of similar to how we discussed in the previous episode about how the Florida Project works, which is activism in art.
We talk about being from Chicago and how much we love it here, but everybody knows how corrupt this city has been throughout history. And the investigative reporting in 1977, the Chicago Sun-Times, think about this, especially knowing now as I get older, people who do buy different places for businesses that they're running. I'm starting to see more and more of my friends doing that. And the investigation was into a city inspection. So what they did is they bought a building and staffed it with a bunch of people that were investigative reporters to see how city inspectors would take bribes to overlook inspection issues. Immediately, you read that early on and you're like, oh, yeah, this needs to happen. Like, people need to kind of get in there deep to really bring this out. Otherwise, there's so many people, and we'll get into this too, that are in on the con.
Right.
There's so many people. There's so many levels of people. If you say, oh, I saw somebody take $20 to overlook the piping in my bathroom over here, and you go and tell your alderman, chances are the alderman's in on it and it's not going to do anything about it. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, that's the point right there, that investigative reporting, unless you are the person who captures it firsthand and you're in with amongst the people who are doing it, you're never going to expose people because it runs too high up the ladder.
That makes me think of, I wanted to revisit The Wire, which I haven't seen it since it first came out, but the structure of that show about the drug war is so incredible in terms of, like, each season they focus on a different area. You got the drug dealers, you have the cops, and one of the seasons focuses on the journalists and what aspect of that works into the drug war.
Thinking about our days of talking about Oz back in the old Suncoast days. I mean, I haven't seen Oz in years, but I remember I always had I don't want to get close to prison stuff. Maybe it just felt like too real, like I don't want to know too much about it because I don't want to ever be there. And so I never was like, I want to watch some entertaining show about people in prison. But Oz was definitely wow, some shocking stuff in there. I'd love to go and revisit that now after having all this understanding of prison systems and reading this book.
I'm sure we'll have a little bit to talk about J.K. Simmons maybe in a future episode.
Yeah, right. No foreshadowing here.
Yeah. So I want to get into it. Like, Bauer does give a pretty extensive background in terms of how slavery formed into private prisons. And essentially, for about 150 years after slavery, plantation prisons were the norm in many states, especially in the South, where prisoners, they were primarily used as labor. The government would essentially, in the states, would essentially contract certain infrastructure projects to be completed, like farm or road work. And the states would contract with the private prisons to use the labor to get the work completed instead of actually hiring workers to do it because it's far cheaper. And that really kind of sets the stage for the long-term process of these plantation prisons and how they formed into private prisons. And essentially states would see the revenue coming in. They would be jealous of that revenue, and then they would start trying to save money by operating and outsourcing to private prisons. And there is a lot of background into this, and it's a very interesting and very heavy historical context. One of the main key takeaways of that aspect, though, is once private prisons demonstrated that they could make that money and a profit for themselves, the states, like I said, became jealous of that revenue. Instead of operating prison, they could just outsource it to the private prisons, save money, and thus creating the growth for more private prisons. And unfortunately, this creates a clear incentive to have as many people in prison as possible to maintain that profit.
Yeah, so in Chapter 8, speaking to what you just said, there's a passage that says revenue generation was irresistible. Irresistible. The passage, penitentiary wouldn't be a threat to white supremacy. It would support it. So now we're getting into a little bit of the oppression aspect of all this, right? This would happen in the Civil War as a way for the South to become stronger, too, and build power against the industrialized North in textile manufacturing. I mean, that's another thing, too. How do we beat them in this war that the North wants to take away slaves? Well, we need to take people and really put them to work and build up our economy and all these things that will help us be a better defender. I think it all plays into it.
Again, it just is a long line, and I think it's definitely part of the reason why we see and are living in a time of mass incarceration in society, which is essentially the next step to emerge from slavery. You had slavery first, then you had Jim Crow laws and segregation, and now that's been followed by this explosion of people in prison. Which mostly consists of black and brown people. And I think that direct line connecting prisons to slavery is definitely what's most appalling to me. Just a few numbers for context. In 2017, we had 2.2 million people in prisons and jails, which is up 500% over the last 40 years. So it's like America has 5% of the world's population in terms of the amount of people who live here, but we have 25% of the world's prison population. So how does a country that makes up only 5%, but we have a quarter of all the people in prison in the world?
Shocking, man. I mean, I don't know anything about that. For instance, when people were talking about their prison sentences for marijuana use, I didn't know any reason. I don't know, I don't smoke pot, so I'm kind of like, what is like the deal? Like, I don't care if people smoke it or they don't, really. It's just kind of like one of those things I never really thought about. But then I started thinking about the people that are already in jail for their offenses, and then why everyone has been up in arms about, like, should they continue their sentences. And then I'm understanding that in Chapter 12, they talk about making it easier to get incarcerated. Any small-time offense would work. The state could keep profiting from cheap convict labor. And then in Chapter 18, they talk about, like, some of these offenses that landed people in jail just were so minor. Throwing rocks, suspected loitering. It really makes you think that the entire state was in it on a plot to profit.
Essentially, 1/5 of the inmates at Wynn are in for drug-related crimes. Getting busted with a joint near a school will typically land you about 6 years, as I believe is quoted in the book. So now the drug war, which was racially charged, led to the high rates of black and brown people in prison since the 80s and its inception. And luckily, after only 40 fucking years, we've started to see the benefits of decriminalization of drugs, but it's been a slow process with that. I mean, me personally, I've done drugs. I've smoked joints near schools when I was a kid in high school, but for many reasons, including my skin color and living in a safe and mildly middle-class town, I was never worried about getting in trouble for doing drugs, let alone spending time in prison for it and having that a mark hold me down for the rest of my life.
Not having that fear, you're going to get a slap on the wrist. Your parents are going to get mad at you, and that's probably the worst that's going to happen to you, right?
Absolutely. I mean, again, it's the drug war that's been going on since Reagan in the 80s, and as I mentioned earlier, it's a huge reason for mass incarceration. It's like the amount of people in prison for drug and drug-related crimes is pretty astounding, and so it's when you see the push for decriminalization, it's really not only people who just want to smoke weed more. It's largely to address the fact that so many people get these felony records on on themselves, and then prevents them from being able to find housing or work. If you get a drug-related felony account and then you can't find a job, it's like, what's the point of being even released from prison afterwards?
Yeah, it's not just the money that they're making by this prisoner being in there. Now when they get out, how do people get jobs? Like they're screwed. It's like we used you all up. We squeezed all the blood out of the turnip that we could. Now go into the world. We're done with you. But there's no help.
Yeah.
There's no help for them to get jobs or anything like that. That's basically what you're saying. Like, we took everything from you and now you've got nothing. Go fend for yourself out there. Oh, by the way, we're going to put a asterisk on you like Barry Bonds' home run ball that will be carried around with you for the rest of your time, and you're unemployable.
Unemployable. Apply to rent an apartment. You can be rejected for that. It's literally the opposite of rehabilitation. That
makes me think of something also in current events that just yesterday or the day before, I watched Dave Chappelle. He had posted something called Unforgiven. Had you seen that?
No, I missed it.
So he was talking about Chappelle's show, and I saw the David Letterman show he did, and lately, he was on Saturday Night Live. I love Dave Chappelle, and I really got this overwhelming idea of slavery and what he was talking about in that, because he brings up some things about like the first couple times he really felt like he was getting had. And one is about being at a magic thing and thinking he knew the card the guy was going to pull up. But then he realized that everybody in the area was in on it. They were all in on it, and that's why he lost. Because everybody was able to change his idea of what was real because of that situation. And then the second time was in part with, Comedy Central. And they all had all the people and the bigwigs in the room, and they were looking at this younger kid that was going to make them money. And they got him to sign the contract because, of course, you want that. That's what you're working towards, to get this on TV. And that show made so much money, but he made nothing. I mean, he's basically saying, I didn't really think about it until later when I thought all those people in the room were in on it. And that really correlated to this book. Everybody, as I talked about, is in on it. So you can't stop anything if there's nobody in there wanting it to end, because everybody is making money off it except for the slave, the person out there doing that stuff. So that just is something that, I don't know, again, maybe I'm completely off base, but it just reminded me of that story he was saying, is that right now there's a contract going out for Comedy Central to have people who love Dave Chappelle watch his show, yet he makes no money from it. I mean, even getting into chapter 14 where they talk about using slaves and convicts for everything, any way to make money, harvesting body fluids, to sell for plasma and things, and even their bodies in death, making a profit on human life in any way the state could. We're not just talking about whipping them and having them pick cotton. We're talking about even after death, we're going to make money on your body. It's so completely wrong in so many ways.
Well, they definitely get to a point, and we'll get into it, where each inmate you can monetize each inmate, where I think it was $3,300 a year increase with every inmate that they have. So Wow. It's a clear incentive to have as many, quote, customers, as they call them multiple times, in the prison themselves.
Thinking about that with just the idea of also making sure that the inmates don't realize what's happening. you know?
Oh, absolutely. Suppression of information is age-old. Yeah.
Banning books in the system, especially ones that talk about what Shane's exposing in this book. I mean, nobody would be able to read this book in prison. Are you kidding me? In Shane's book, he writes about the facts that slavery and incarceration were books that were definitely vetted and you could not read. Yeah, I think he even says something, and don't quote me, but something about like Mein Kampf was able to be read in prison, but you couldn't read a book on slavery.
No, that's true. I was definitely shocked when they showed the books at Wynn specifically that were banned. Books on Buddhism and Tai Chi, 50 Shades of Grey, books by Sojourner Truth and Richard Wright, the novelist. Those are all banned, but you're right. Mein Kampf from Adolf Hitler and books by David Duke of the Ku Klux Klan, those were not banned. So it's a clear white ideology when it comes to the topics that they allow the inmates to be exposed to.
Right.
I believe they call them too incendiary or deemed a security threat, those former books, as they consider them. So that tells you a lot about the control and the suppression of information, really cultural-wide, but obviously here in the prison itself. I want to get into when Shane actually begins his tenure here. So he applies for the job with the Corrections Corporation of America, CCA. And what's crazy about it is he didn't lie about who he was at all. Any quick Google search for him would have shown that Shane Bauer is a reporter for Mother Jones, the magazine. But I think it shows that it's such a predatory system. They were basically begging him to accept this shitty guard position for $9 an hour. He's an investigative journalist, but he definitely didn't need to hide his identity very well because they are essentially preying on the poverty-stricken town and the people who need work there.
Yeah, I think they say something about how $9 is all you're going to get. Like, there's no chance for growth. Maybe your position would grow, but you're not going to get more than $9.
No.
You could go to Walmart and make $9 an hour, or you could work at the correctional center and possibly get shanked for $9 an hour.
No, yeah, Winfield in Louisiana has about 5,000 residents. I believe they said almost half of which live below the poverty line. So it's clearly a little town with no prospects for work and most people living in poverty. And like you said, not many other options for work other than the low-wage jobs in places like the Wynn Correctional Facility. I didn't realize this. I mentioned how America has one of the highest incarceration rates in the world, but Louisiana has one of the highest incarceration rates in the country, in our country. So it's roughly 5 times that of China. And the Wynn facility itself is the oldest privately owned prison in the country, which I think these facts are the reason why Bauer chose this specific prison to find a job in.
Yeah, wow.
So he goes into training, which mostly consists of watching just a few videos of the founding of the company. And he's noting there's a clear sense that the people training him are notifying the inmates, as I said earlier, as, quote, customers, and that Wynn is a great place to work. Again, this is the training crew, not the actual staff or anything. The other people who are in the training with them, many who don't make it all the way through, are clearly there because of the lack of other job opportunities. And like I said, it's a poverty-stricken town, and this low-wage poverty work is essentially all that's available for many of the people there. It just really kind of creates the sense of desperation. It's like you have this prison. It's not just preying on inmates, but it's also preying on the desperate people living there who are just trying to get by.
Yeah, well said. And, you know, the first time in one of those orientations early on in the book where I thought something's up here, there was a little footnote that explained it. He's talking about the orientation and that the trainer had taken them outside and said, okay, we're going to expose you to the pepper spray or whatever it was. And they let off like that smoke bomb. And, you know, everyone's coughing, can't breathe, and different things like that. And the footnote, I don't know if you read that, but it said guards are not required to do this in their training. So basically it's just like that kind of macho mentality, like, let's get them out there and expose them to all the terrible things that could happen, but it's not required. You don't have to require to put a human being through something like that. Why would you?
We'll definitely get into it, but yeah, there's a lot of the, quote, training, the gun training, the tactics training that exists merely to cover themselves in case they get sued for something. It's a liability. They use it as a liability proof so that if something happens, they get sued, they can show that the guards, quote, went through training.
I believe this book was either published or being written during the time of Ferguson, uprising on police and what had happened and occurred in Ferguson. So there's even a mention of it in the book that they really need to cover themselves because the news is reporting on so much injustice right now. Let's make sure that we don't get caught up in it, kind of thing.
That's a great point. So one of the mantras, especially in the South, is, quote, outsource prison management and save money in the process. So this is essentially the state's attitude in the South. This is all over the country, but it's, again, predominantly in the South, that if it's cheaper to contract with private prisons, they would save money running their own state-run facilities. Now, CCA, company that runs this correctional facility that Bauer's in, they reported $1.8 billion in revenue the year that Bauer worked there and profited more than $221 million. So that's a profit, takeaway profit that year of over $220 million. And as I said, this comes out to more than $3,300 for each prisoner in its care. So with each inmate, they increase their profits. And now, if that doesn't tell you that there's an incentive to keep people in prisons with shitty staff and no services for rehabilitation, then I don't really know what does.
What does consist of the bottom line? The number one thing that goes into costs is their staffing, right?
Right.
And Shane Bauer constantly talks about how they're understaffed and how people can't even go into the prison yard because they don't have enough guards to watch them. And of course, what's that going to do to the prisoner? It's going to make them feel like they are trapped inside. There's nowhere to go. There's no sunlight. So that's one issue that comes up. But then also the medical issue, which Shane Bauer talks about a lot too. And that has to do with I don't have this quote in front of me, but there was something about how to make suicide, change that into an idea that it wasn't suicide so that the penitentiary doesn't have to pay a certain amount. And they actually make the inmate have to pay for their own suicide. Pat, maybe you have better numbers and figures on that, but I couldn't believe it. It was shocking. And medical care in general is something that if you complain that you've got a cut that's going gangrene, you're going to have to wait that out and figure it out on your own. Most of the time, that's the way it goes because it's so expensive. The medical care is so expensive that they find any way not to send people to medical care facilities, which ends up killing people.
Yeah, so that suicide point is a big one. At a month or so in, during his tenure, they start to send Bauer into the suicide watch, keeping an eye on the inmates who they suspect will try to commit suicide. It's basically just a side room with 2 cells and 1 guard to watch the 2 inmates who are stationed there. And obviously one point of this is it's not very cost effective to have 1 guard watching 2 people as opposed to 200 people. So they try to keep that down as much as possible. And one of the people he is tasked with at one point watching is Damien. They've had brief exchanges, and they appear to get along. Eventually, Damien is taken out of suicide watch, even though he still thinks he is going to hurt himself. He eventually does commit suicide in his own cell. And like I said, it was certainly no secret of Damien's state. He went on suicide watch at least 17 times during the 3.5 years before he died. And when a single untrained guard is supposed to act as a psychiatrist, this will most likely not resolve anything for the person. Damien was actually studying law on his own while in prison. He organized hunger strikes in objection to the harsh treatment of the prisoners received. The extent of the report upon his death included inmate had a long history of playing games and trying to manipulate the system. So as you mentioned, it just goes perfectly into the lack of accountability. And again, it all comes down to the bottom line. There's not really, if you provide psychiatrists, if you provide direct health care, these cut into the profits.
And again, we talk about not knowing the answer to any of these things that we're talking about. It's just good to talk about. That certainly does not seem right. What the solution is, I don't know. How do you get better medical care to anybody? I don't know. It's such a complicated thing, but that's hopefully why we elect officials and presidents and people like that to help navigate that ground for us, people that are smarter than I am to try to figure it out. That's the whole thing, is just being knowledgeable. Knowledge is power. So understanding that there's an injustice being done is a good way to start. I wanted to talk a little bit about labor camps and really building this country, building America through oppression and slavery. I don't know if many people realize that, but I thought of this Joe Strummer song called Long Shadow from Streetcore, his last official record. And he has a line on there that stuck with me. It was, "I hear mutterings on the chain gangs. It was those men who built the roads." It just reminded me then of the song Chain Gang by Sam Cooke. Now, I'm a very big Sam Cooke fan. Sam had one of the best voices in all of music, to me anyway. The man used his life to, as I talked about earlier with Chappelle and different things like that, to creatively, and especially in a time for him, when it was not going to be popular for his career or anything like that, to bring up injustices. I mean, a change is going to come. Everybody, I think, understands that and what the message was behind that song. But Chain Gang, a huge, huge hit. And he's basically talking about the content in this book. He's talking about that, that's the sound of the men working on the chain. All day long, I work so hard till the sun is going down. And he paints the picture almost beautifully. But what he's trying to tell you is, like, these are the people that were out there doing this. The reason you can drive your car down the road is because these men built the roads. And exposing racism through song. I'm grateful to artists like Sam Cooke to find a creative way to expose the stories. The horrors described in this book would do a lot to change our society if people would only have a greater thirst to understand history and the mistakes that were made. But it does take people to talk about the times we're in. That's one good thing I can take away from social media these days. There are a lot of people out there creatively trying to tell these stories to make it in a way that's ingestible. Sam Cooke was doing it all those years ago, trying to talk about what we're talking about right now, racism, injustice, slavery. And again, that was a number one hit song that nobody would have thought about. I mean, I guess you could talk about Bruce Springsteen and Born in the USA. Every year around the 4th of July, people talk about that song like the number one pro anthem, when really it's about Vietnam, right?
Yeah. No, I think that's a great point, and it definitely exposes the potential for art and especially music to shed light on these types of things.
Right.
Which is kind of the point of what we're doing here.
It definitely helps to be educated in all things, especially these dark times in our history. That's really a big takeaway for me, because I do understand the world a little bit better just by reading this 300-page book. And it didn't take me more than a few hours a day to read the book.
Yeah. It's one of the best things you can do with your time. So over the first few weeks that Bauer is stationed at Wynn, there's a consistent push for him to be tougher on the inmates. He tries to be casual with them at first, but there's always this insistence from the other officers to be tougher. As he starts to really fall into that, especially with the way some of the inmates do try to disrespect him and call him names and actually threaten his own safety multiple times if he shows too much slack. This leads to him expressing in writing more of the inmates up for infractions for the rules, which are pretty strict. No personal property other than a short list of essentials. We kind of mentioned the banned books, being on time for roll call, stuff like that. And there's an incident when an inmate is written up and he loses his, quote, good time. So now he'll be in prison for an extra 30 days, and the prison will receive an additional $1,000 to keep him there. Again, it's just another economic incentive.
Also to manipulate people. Staying in prison for a lot of the inmates, they think, well, I'm getting a free meal. I'm sure you've thought about Shawshank Redemption a few times as we've been talking through this, but it's almost like when you get outside, the disorientation is so stark, and especially in Shawshank Redemption, that was the Brooks character, right, who ends up committing suicide. Sorry, spoiler alert for anybody listening to this, but that character, it was his whole life being in prison and the friends that he had and needed that order and structure in his life. So it gets into that, and then, again, like a lot of different levels of manipulation. And in Chapter 20, in regards to inmate guards, I'm sure, Pat, you probably want to talk about this because this was an interesting section for me to read about. This is the quote in it: "The oppressed become the oppressor." And that works on multiple levels. We'll talk about it with the COs even. But to become a trustee guard is what they called it, which was like another level up for the inmates. if you're a trustee guard, you would get certain perks. They talk about like better food, you'd be eating hamburgers, your housing, etc. And the obedience of a prisoner was won by making this position the absolute best that you could attain in the system. And you would fight to obey every command to stay in that role. It reminds me of scenes in Shawshank Redemption, as we were just talking about, where Andy Dufresne becomes this way to the warden, even though with Andy, he had a method to his madness of being in that role, so that eventually the end game was to break out of prison. The idea of the oppressed becoming the oppressor, I don't know, even like in scenes when you watch movies where there's somebody shaving, there's a prisoner shaving the warden or something, and you're like, he's going to cut his throat. But he doesn't, because he knows he's got it good in the role he's got.
No, that touches on a essential part that runs throughout the entire memoir. That's what makes the memoir aspect of this so interesting, is he gets really intimate with the power of being this guard plays into his own psyche. He brings up the research at Stanford where they studied the roles of prisoners and guards and their differences. Random people were assigned to either be a prisoner or a guard. They eventually had to stop the experiment because the guards started treating the prisoners so poorly that their lives and their well-being was in danger. And this is just an academic study. And this really gets to the question of whether people tasked with guarding prisoners are really any different from the prisoners themselves, and vice versa. Essentially asking, what does power in these situations do to men? In this case, they are poverty-stricken workers receiving poverty wages, but the officers have a chance to display power over another human being. What does that do to a man? I believe the quote from Bauer is, "We take comfort in the notion of an unbridgeable gulf between good and evil. But maybe we should understand that evil is incremental, something that we are all capable of given the right circumstances," end quote. And like I said, he starts to feel that pull of power, along with the difficulty of keeping so many inmates in order with such little staffing. So all that just goes perfectly into the way you were describing the oppression and how that works on people.
Man, what an interesting thing to say, because, like, again, it's so easy for people to talk and discuss. I mean, even in the end of it, when he goes to the stockholders meeting, they almost try to nail Bauer without mentioning him directly by saying, you know, there's all these people reporting on this stuff, but they don't know what it's like inside the prison. They don't live it. Right. They don't know what it's like to be in there. And again, there's no way in hell I'm ever going to condone anything that's happening, but it is bring up what you're saying about, like, can you be corrupted by the circumstances that you're presented? And that's why I'm so grateful to have philosophies like the Stoicism to understand who you are and what you need to do to navigate no matter your circumstances almost, if you live a philosophy like that. But it's hard to say because all of a sudden someone's giving you a ton of money or you're being influenced by this or being manipulated over here. It's so hard to say what you would do as an individual in those circumstances.
I mean, through history, it is largely come out of economic scarcity. You know, you can say what you're capable of or what you would do or what you wouldn't do, but when the scarcity comes up and it's hitting you day to day and you don't have enough food for yourself or your family, we've seen time and time again through history people following orders and doing things that they would have never thought they would do.
Think about just what you just said is what's so scary, because you're being preyed upon. What people don't understand is when they are that destitute is that they are being manipulated and preyed upon, and most likely put in that position, for better or for worse, from the people who are trying to manipulate you. And that is so wrong on so many levels, I can't even begin to talk about it.
So he goes through firearms training without actually firing a gun, which is insane. They pass everyone, apparently, and they just give the officers a gun no matter what. You know, there's a point when he has the gun at his side, he's already strapped to it, and one of the guys training him is telling him, all right, get out there. And he just realizes, oh, I'm about to walk around corralling people up with this gun that I haven't actually even fired yet, because they just go ahead and train everybody and pass everyone for the mark of just saying that they went through training. And now he's in this position, still getting just paid $9 an hour, and he has the authority of not only just ordering people around, but actually taking somebody's life if he needs to.
Again, it's a impoverished town, and it's kind of like, all right, well, we need bodies in here. to do this stuff. We're not going to really check your background. We're not going to see if you can fire a gun. We'll do our best to train you based on these tapes that you can watch. But like, what kind of training do these people have? And this guy's a reporter coming in here. It's insane.
Yeah. And so the day-to-day life for the inmates is essentially nothing. It's pretty bare. Pretty much all vocational or training classes, which are, people assume are available to inmates ostensibly for, quote, rehabilitation, they've been pretty much axed entirely to save money and increase profits. So even if one of the inmates wanted to train for something, so he could get a job upon release, it's not really available for him at Wynn.
Chapter 22, inventing games for the public to come see. Now, again, when we're talking about these chapters, it goes on and off talking about the history of correction systems, then Shane Bauer's own experience in his 4 months being a CO in the Wynn Correctional Facility. So in Chapter 22, when it's talking about the history, I believe that this was more recent history. I think inventing games like a rodeo where inmates would compete for cash prizes. They called it hard money. And justifying this old world gladiator circus as a way to prepare inmates for return to normalized civil life, for their way to be placed back into society by these crazy games. I was just blown away that would have been justified. This is the quote. Our objective here is to return each inmate to society better equipped to handle his responsibilities, and this can be a start in this direction. So, just to let you know out there, listener, what they're talking about is a bunch of people in a rodeo-like setting, a bunch of people meaning prisoners, and they're running after a bull that has money attached to it, and they're trying to get the money, and whoever gets the money wins. They're talking about that as a way of getting people ready to go back to civilized life. Unbelievable when I read that happened in our history.
What's the name of the fights in like Django Unchained and Native Son when they pit the two slaves together where they just basically have to beat the shit out of each other?
Definitely brought up a lot of Django Unchained images for me in reading this book.
When I was reading the rodeo parts, that was the number one thing that I kept on thinking about. In Native Son, which was used in Django Unchained, Candy, Leonardo DiCaprio's character, is pitting two slaves against each other, where they just have to fight and beat the shit out of each other until one of them dies, thus one of them reigning champion. And this is all done for gambling. This is all done for entertainment, the life of these people.
Yeah, insane. Get that man a tall beard. That's his fucking reward. Unbelievable. By the way, great movie.
That beard looked pretty great after watching that brutal scene. This is at the point when Bauer really is starting to break down. He's really questioning his own morality and whether or not he can continue to do this. At one point, he's clearing out the cell of inmates, and he comes across a suicide letter. He says, quote, "I'm locking men up day in and day out. Some have been incarcerated since they were children. Some are in prison for using drugs. Others are poor people who committed crimes to stay afloat. I've been telling myself that to really investigate, we sometimes have to get our hands dirty. But what happens if I see a guard beating someone? Do I try to stop him, or do I film it? What was the woman who wrote that letter actually serious, and I just ignored it? What if she killed herself?" End quote.
She's definitely talking about taking pills and things like that in the letter. And the reason that he's able to read that is because they need to vet everything that goes in and out of the prison. There's a point where he gets looked at, and you almost think only because there's nobody else left in the prison because everybody's quitting to get promoted, they're going to promote him within where he'll have a little bit more freedom as a sergeant, I think that they would call him. And then in his sort of job review, they're saying, you're amazing and keep doing what you're doing, and kind of like nothing negative to talk about in this assessment. And at the end of it, he kind of just like says he smiles, but everything behind him does not want to smile because he just knows what's happening in here. And he almost at that point, he's getting manipulated, and he even talks about being ready to quit. And at that point, that's when that comes up. And like having to tell his wife, I think I'm going to stay a little bit longer. Not being able to really get out. Really interesting. And this is 4 months. It's not that long a time. Like he's getting ingrained in here. He's making relationships with prisoners, and at the same time, he thinks he might get stabbed by one of them. God, can you imagine going to work with all of that at play every day? I mean, it would break you down. There's no doubt.
He deeply regrets doing such a great job in this role, even though that's what he committed to do. And again, this just plays into the conflict that he's feeling himself and the morality at play. And so I think you put that perfectly. He's offered the position, and he, like you said, he really actually considers it for a minute, not necessarily like as a way of life or a career, but like to continue the investigation. And he basically questions himself whether or not that's for his own doing or for the investigation. Who's it really benefiting?
Right. Yeah. And I guess that leads us to the end of the book where, actually getting out. That's a pretty crazy story. A lot of these things were page turners too when he tells these stories, because he mentions, and this is something I think is important to point out to our listeners, he mentions that if ever he gets into a position where they're going to question him and who he is, he's going to tell the truth. Isn't that right, Pat?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, so he just wants to make sure that I'm not doing anything that's really being facetious here. They could look me up at any time. I'm giving my real name, and if they ask me, I'm going to tell them I'm an investigative reporter. And it's good to note that the reason he has to do this is because the prison systems will not allow anybody to come into and give any kind of reporting that they don't want to structure their own way. So he has to kind of do this investigative reporting to get a truthful representation of what's actually happening in the system. That goes into him finally ready to leave, and when he does, it's almost made possible by his associate, James, I believe is his name, that comes to take photography because they're going to do this expose in Mother Jones. They need pictures of the facility, they need different things, they need interviews with Bauer when he was there. So this guy, James, comes there, is in the field trying to take these time-lapse things. He's got a GoPro going on and getting all of this imagery. And at night, he drops, I think it was his memory card or something like that, and he's looking for it with his iPhone flashlight, and that triggers the penitentiary guards, I think they called the SORT team, to come and investigate. And really, he could have gotten away with it, but he remembered that he left the GoPro on the street sign, and he was like, oh my God, there's a interview that I did with Shane, and it would incriminate him. So he's like, I got to go back and get it. And once he goes back to get it, then the cops pull him over, and then they put him in jail.
They lock him up. He starts searching his property without a warrant. Bauer is aware of this, so he has to pull up shop. He checks into a hotel. He mails all of his documents, all the recordings, all the writings, everything that would incriminate him. He mails it back to the magazine, and the next day he calls in sick. And that essentially leads to the end of his tenure at Wynn Correctional Facility. Right.
He basically just leaves. He felt real danger. His wife had come to visit him, so she was with him. I mean, it was, like I said, a page turner at that point. And they talk about the way that James was treated. And they had body cam footage that Bauer was able to see about the whole scene and how it played out. And they were basically like making fun of him. And yeah, later on, somebody had texted somebody that eventually Bauer got the picture, and the geotag was inside the sheriff's office. So they had taken pictures of Shane on the memory card, which they were not supposed to look at. You know, that was against the law to go through James's footage or any. He didn't want them, and he had told them you can't see it, which was within his rights. But in the sheriff's office, they actually did, and they took a picture of it to alert the warden that you have an investigative reporter in your midst. And this was like 10 months later, I think he said, when he finally got that picture. So they did know. And so him making the move to skip town was the right one, because he would have gotten...
Absolutely.
He would have gotten... Something bad might have happened.
Now, the last stop for Bauer in this journey is the shareholders meeting. He buys a single stock in CCA, the Corrections Corporation of America, so that he can attend the meeting and kind of wrap up this investigation, not for good, but kind of like this tenure of his time as the correctional officer. And he tries to ask some questions from the people who run the corporation. So Terrell Don Hudo, who is the founder of CCA and kind of one of the modern archetypes of private for-profit prisons, he tries to question him, but he gets nowhere, unsurprisingly. He's pretty abrasive. He's aware that the questions that he's asking won't necessarily get him anywhere, but he feels the need to do so. And it's at this kind of point when he questions like whether reform is possible at all for private prisons. Medical care, as you've mentioned, medical care, security, staffing, fair wages. These are all the highest costs, and these are all things that cost money, and they all cut into profits. He closes on his thoughts about the CEOs at this meeting with, quote, "They convince themselves with remarkable ease that they are in the business of punishment because it makes the world better, not because it makes them rich." So this entire theatrical CEO meeting where they're all congratulating each other and really reinforcing the notion that they are, quote, making the world better, is obviously 100% antithetical to everything he just experienced for the past year.
So, Pat, this book is something that you brought to me to read. What remains for you in this book? Maybe you could talk a little bit about why you wanted to talk about this, and again, what is your takeaway? How do you live your life differently after having consumed this conscious content?
For me, what remains are really two things. First, it's really that I have to maintain a sense of scrutiny when it comes to the things that act as for-profit in our society and the way I view them. And I just do flat out believe some things should not be for-profit. They simply should not exist as a way to make money. Things like access to health care, incarceration, when there's an incentive to have a steady stream of, quote, customers or inmates, in this case, in this conversation, I personally think it's doing more harm than good. The second aspect for me is books like this is just another reminder to me how important good journalism is for a society. You know, journalism, especially investigative journalism, really is a check on power. It's how people know about injustices in the world. And that's precisely why some people in power recently have had such a disdain for the media, because it's what stands between, for example, a king ruling over people like a tyrant. I'm certainly guilty, of everybody. It's some days where the only news I get is from Facebook or Twitter, but it's a book like this that consistently reminds me to dig a little bit deeper than that. How about you?
I love hearing how you have interpreted this because that helps me too. And I think, as we said beginning this conversation, is there's just so much to take in here. I love history and I love everything about it, even the dark parts, because you can learn about it and do better. And I think this is just another reminder that continuing to do the work in my life of understanding things that I might not know much about is very important, because of all of the things about slavery. And when you talk about racism, to have more empathy for people, you need to do the work. You need to do the work in your life to understand why it's important to listen when people talk about racism, because this happened. This is not fake. This happened in America. Sure, people might say it was a long time ago, but it's still being echoed today, and that is such a shame. But it is up to us to do the work, to understand people better so that we can live a better life together and more united. I definitely take that away from everything that I'm consuming, but especially something like this, and understanding the prison system, which I didn't understand at all. And it really gets back to why I really want to get on board with Johnny Cash's prison albums like San Quentin and Folsom Prison Blues or Folsom Prison. He had talked about the injustices of all of these things, and I always wanted to understand it more, but I couldn't. I didn't read this book yet. I didn't understand why he was going to these prisons. Why, everyone thinks it's so badass that he went to a prison, and you see all these like tough guys, hooting and hollering, but why are they? What was he doing? What was he saying that they aligned with? He understood this kind of stuff. People like Sam Cooke understood this, and they were able to use that to put their God-given gift of creativity and their artistic talent to work, to tell those stories. And I'd love to be able to do that in my own work somehow. Small in comparison to those giants, but I really do love understanding this more so that I can really live a better life of understanding of people. That's really... People just want to be understood, and what's wrong with that, I guess?
No, I think that's great. I personally think as a friend, you've proven your ability to express these types of issues through your art and your music. And it's just one of the reasons why you're so talented at it.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I appreciate that. I definitely try to make sure, especially as I get older, to at least incorporate something that's going to make people think a little bit about their place in this world and how they live it. So thank you. That's a great compliment. Well, as we sign off here, Pat, I'm not sure if you have anything else to say, but I do have one last parting word that I'd like to quote from this book, if you don't mind. I'm laughing because it's so fucking great, and I think it's just the perfect way to end this. So at one point, Shane is in one of his first sweeps of the cell blocks, and they're going through and they're confiscating things that are, drugs or whatever else the inmates might be having. And he comes across a novel that's being written by a inmate, and it's a novel called Hoodlum Child. So I'd like to end this episode, and I just loved this dedication. And so I'd like to end our episode on American Prison by Shane Bauer by saying the dedication to all the hustlers, bastards, strugglers, and hoodlum childs who are chasing their dreams.
I love it. Captures the essence perfectly.
Yeah, exactly.
And with that, thanks for listening to Remainders. We'll see you next time.
You have been listening to Remainders. This episode was written, narrated, and produced by Darren and Patrick McIntyre. Original music, episode art, logo, and editing by Darren Burrell. Find out what else remains by visiting our website at remainderspod.com. And we're on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Just search @RemainersPod. Please tell anyone you can about our show, and we look forward to telling you more of what remains next time.